The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
When Jesus enters the world as the Word, as the same Word that spoke the world into being, the same Word who was the active agent of all of creation, he puts a demand on language that no one else can, because he has proprietary ownership of it. It means then our uses of language are either dignified by their glorying of Jesus. So if we've channeled those words in the direction of glorying Jesus, whether that's explicitly or implicitly through liturgy and praise, or through letters and words which are grounded and founded in the glory of God, even if they're not talking about him, then we're stewarding well what he owns.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Andrew Roycroft is a poet and a pastor in Northern Ireland. His new collection, 33, consists of 33 poems, each 33 words long, meditating on the life and the words of Jesus from the Gospel of John, plus 33 essays about the 33 poems. Andrew Roycroft, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today to talk about your new collection of poems, 33, subtitled Reflections on John's Gospel.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. Lovely to see you again. Yeah.
So this is a collection of 33 word poems. So that's 999 words.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad you kept it under 1,000.
With a little bit tagged on at the back for
oh, that's true. Yeah.
Content. So
right.
Yeah, but yeah, very, very brief poems. Yeah.
You didn't invent this format. Tell me about the history of 33 word, not just 33 word poems, 33 word poems.
Yeah, well, I encountered it in Dermot McCulloch's History of the Reformation. And I mean, as someone whose background was medieval studies, I found his capture of medieval piety and all of that pre-Reformation to be really interesting, because I think there's generally an assumption that true spirituality began in 1517. Whereas when you go back into the medieval period, there's a really rich spiritual experience, spiritual disciplines that were far from maybe the excesses that the Reformation faced into. And Dermot McCulloch has this lovely section in his book on the Reformation where he's in no hurry to get to Luther, and he allows you to marinate in sort of medieval piety. And there was something there just really caught my attention, which was this idea that in the medieval period, prayers would have been written in poetic form. They would have been written with just 33 words, and those 33 words then were designed to reflect one word for each year of Christ's life. And I think it being the medieval church, that corresponded to sort of touchable and tangible things like beads that then could be used to work through those 33 years. So that really sparked it off my head, because it combined all sorts of interests: poetry, the life of Christ, and the sort of medieval element of good piety, good spiritual pursuit. So yeah, that's where it sort of began to germinate. But it seems to have been an established pattern of writing and praying and devotion in the medieval period.
So your collection is a collection of meditative poems on the Book of John.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Why John? How did you settle on that gospel as your subject matter?
Yeah, when I began to think through the background of what Dermot McCulloch had shared, I began to think about the idea of, well, could I begin to write contemporary poems that embrace that discipline of 33? And I suppose a process of refinement, I began to think about the Gospels broadly. Should I just select episodes out of Christ's life? That felt very general. And it felt a little bit like I perhaps wouldn't honor the generic priorities of each gospel, the preoccupations of each writer. So I began to think, well, look, if I took one gospel and began to write poems based on that, where would I go? And immediately John seemed like a good fit. His language is so vivid, it's so theologically loaded. His ruminations in the life of Christ are so deep and quite often suggestive as well, which I think is a good space for poetry to work in. So I began to tinker around, just taking the pages of the Bible and beginning little poetry sketches, and find, yes, actually there's so much imagery here. And for 33 poems, it allows you to import some of John's work. So if there's allusions or rich metaphor, you can borrow that, which allows the reader to explore that through John and see that enriched without having to say too much more about it yourself. So there's a kind of a hoard of words and ideas and metaphors that were already there because of John's style. So that seemed like a good fit to go for.
When you say his language is suggestive, what's an example of that kind of suggestiveness that you had in mind?
I mean, I think there's these enigmatic statements of Jesus, in the Gospels, which in John's Gospel, which very often are met with either incredulity or misunderstanding or misappropriation by the people who hear them at first. So, a prime example of that would be the I am statements. Jesus doesn't prosaically say, this is what I mean, but he metaphorically says, this is what I am. And it's often in an abstraction that doesn't make a lot of sense until you reverse engineer it back into the Old Testament, or you begin to really think about the implications of that. So, I am the bread of life. The idea of that linking into manna in the wilderness and the whole biblical theological context of Jesus' life, that very terse short statement captures that. Or even his encounter with Martha when Lazarus has passed away, I am the resurrection and the life. And Martha trying to unpack that in the context of trauma. Jesus brings metaphor into that world, which is something we don't generally tend to do. So it seems to me that John has selected and celebrated those elements where Jesus was linguistically profound and conceptually profound as well. And I suppose another example would be the temple, destroy this house and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. It's just so poetically loaded, it's theologically loaded, and it's fully misunderstood by the people who hear it.
Yeah. Sounds like a poem.
Doesn't it? Yeah.
At the end of the book, you have the meditations, the prose meditations on the poems. And you comment at one point that the I am statements of Jesus are compact poems. You call them atomic truths that burst into real hope when we probe them. And I love that idea that the I am statements are compact poems. And I guess you've already touched on this idea that they are they can be unpacked. Sometimes people around Jesus did not unpack them, and sometimes they did, or sometimes they misunpacked them. But that is striking what you said, that moment of grief. he is still speaking in metaphor instead of.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's I suppose one of the things that poetry does is it's a little bit like water. It shapes the environment that it moves in, and I think about contemporary poets whose poetry about the place where I live, for instance, has formed how I think and see and parse that landscape. I can think. I mean, a hero of mine, Seamus Heaney. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. He talks about the boglands. That's it. When you see that territory, it's linguistically captured. Or he talks about. He says, "I shouldered a kind of manhood, stepping in to lift the coffins of dead relations." And every time I'm at a funeral, those words, "I shouldered a kind of manhood when I stepped in to lift the coffins of dead relations." And I think the I am statements do that too. They give us a retrospective on the revelation that has been already given in the Old Testament. But they give us a new perspective. So I think about funerals I conduct as a pastor. The favorite passages in John's Gospel for people in grief are the most richly metaphorical. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And people find in what were originally abstractions in Jesus' language a shape for their experience that I think verbalizes it or gives it a vocabulary, which I suppose is what powerful poetry is supposed to do.
Yeah. I love that language of that metaphor gives us a retrospective way of understanding what has gone before, as well as a new perspective going forward. It makes me think about the very first poem of this collection, where you really are hitting hard the idea of what it means for Jesus to be the Word made flesh. And at one point you say, all former words will now deliver their long pregnant promise. I love that so much. This idea that the Word made flesh and dwelling among us, as you said, reaches back into the Old Testament and says, here's what, here was the long pregnant promise.
Yeah.
In those words.
Yeah. I think there's, we take words for granted, don't we? Words are what we use. They're here. And I suppose John, in the opening of his gospel, reestablishes the fact that God is the Lord of language, and that language is the very mechanism that he uses to create a universe. Therefore, because Christ is the Word, he becomes the grammar for all the words. We parse all reality through him now. That's how we interpret everything. And I suppose for me, that opening poem, as in the opening prologue of John's Gospel, it's so rich theologically, because it's, B.B. Warfield did that famous statement about the Old Testament. He said it's a room richly furnished but dimly lit. Everything is there. It's just we need the New Testament to flick the light switch, and then we see, oh, this was here all the time. And I suppose that wonderful phrase of Warfield's was in my mind of Christ just reinterprets all of this, and what he says is consistent. It's in harmony with everything that's been revealed before, but it super reveals all that, doesn't it? I guess that's
could you say another sentence or two about this idea that the Word, the Word made flesh is the grammar for parsing all the other words? That's not quite self-explanatory.
Yeah. So I suppose we who owns language would be a question that I'm interested in, because we steward language. My parents, they carry a stewardship to pass on a language to me, which I then pass on to others. And so we're borrowers. Everything that we're talking about today is borrowed currency. I don't own any of it. It has been handed to me. I have to bank it and entrust it then to my children. So if we trace that right back to its source, all that language is emanating from God himself. So the moment when Jesus enters the world as the Word, as the same Word that spoke the world into being, the same Word who was the active agent of all of creation, he puts a demand on language that no one else can, because he has proprietary ownership of it. You know, there's almost a little copyright sign beside language that says, you know, this is the intellectual property of Jesus Christ. You know, so it means then our uses of language are either dignified by their glorying of Jesus. So if we've channeled those words in the direction of glorying Jesus, whether that's explicitly or implicitly through liturgy and praise, or through letters and words which are grounded and founded in the glory of God, even if they're not talking about him, then we're stewarding well what he owns. But likewise, if Jesus is the word, if he is the spoken principle of God, from which sort of the singularity from which all other languages exploded and continue to expand into the universe of words, then he has the right then to rebuke forms and uses of language too. He can both direct and command and correct and condemn language, because it's his. I just find that fascinating, that it's his property.
Yeah. You saying that makes me think of something that I heard one of your countrymen, John Lennox, say, that a fundamental difference between a theistic view of a theistic understanding of the world, not doesn't have to be specifically Christian, although as you've been discussing, there's a specifically Christian way of understanding this. But let's just start with theistic and atheistic. In a theistic understanding of the universe, mind gives rise to matter. And in an atheistic view, matter has to give rise to mind.
Wow.
And that's a pretty interesting and helpful distinction.
Yeah, that's powerful. I haven't come across that before, John. That's amazing.
That everything you see, if you're a theist, started with somebody's idea, started with God's idea. And that, I think that's very relevant to the work that poets and other writers do, to say we're sort of as we give voice to the world around us, we're putting it back into language when it started as language and idea and that sort of thing. It's really,
that's wonderful, Jonathan. I haven't thought that through, and that's tremendous, because that's those are two diametrically, maybe opposed, too strong word, but diametrically different ways of viewing everything, all reality, actual reality and articulated reality. And it blurs those lines a little bit too, doesn't it, in terms of the power of words and where they come from. Yeah, that's amazing. I'd love to think about that more.
Yeah, right. Well, I one thing I like about that distinction is it's not especially judgmental. It's just sort of it's not even saying, it's a way of talking about the difference between a theistic and an atheistic view that's not specifically moral.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of anyway.
That's wonderful.
Moving on. Well, when you said that it retroactively, the word retroactively makes sense of all the words that went before, and then moving forward gives us a new perspective on everything that we see. As you said, it's like water; it shapes the environment that we move in. And when you said that, I thought about another one of your poems. And also your meditation on that poem, which is the one about the shepherd and the sheep and the wolves.
Yeah.
And specifically, as you said, in funerals, people take comfort in the idea that metaphor of the Christ being the way, the truth, and the life, and another metaphor that people take comfort in funerals is the Lord is my shepherd. And we have a specific way that we typically think about that, this sort of gentle care. And as you rightly point out, the shepherd isn't just gentle. It's the shepherd sort of lives at that line between danger and comfort. And in destruction and survival, and between chaos and compassion. And I think henceforth, when I think about the Lord as my shepherd, your poem will shape the way I think about that image, because it is, the Psalm 23 is for the most part a very gentle, or at least the way we talk about it is very gentle.
Yeah. I think certainly here when anyone has, we've got our favorite verses that go on the fridge or the living room or scattered around the house. Generally the 23rd Psalm tends to get wheels in the background, as in green grass wheels and sheep and rural and sort of bucolic paradise, or an Irish field. Whereas I remember doing some preaching on Psalm 23 years ago, and I can't remember who the commentator was, but he spelled out the reality of the valley of the shadow of death, and he described the fact that the landscape and the territory that the shepherd was in, finding water, finding pasture, was the shepherd's skill. He wasn't in an abundant environment where he just sort of lay and played the lute while the sheep grazed around. He was much more like an infantryman, actually, in terms of how he faced into that world. So yeah, I think we've possibly domesticated that. And it's funny because the metaphor of Jesus as the good shepherd is immediately followed with the good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. In other words, the good shepherd's life is literally on the line. This is a shepherd who's invested in the true care of his sheep, is laying himself down. And I suppose that is some resonances for our understanding even of shepherding now, as in spiritual shepherding, and maybe that's a massive subject to go into, but the idea of sacrificial shepherding rather than shepherding that fleeces the sheep is extremely live, I suppose, So
yeah. Do you have the poems in front of you? Could you read that poem?
Yeah.
Would you read it? That's number 12.
Number 12. Yeah, that's fine. Keeping the wolf from the door, the shepherd calls. Bringing in his own, he shames the unsound staff of pilfering crooks who came before. Laying down, he rests a flock into his care.
I love it. As I said, that poem and your subsequent meditation, your prose meditation on that, is going to continue to shape how I think about that image, the Lord is my shepherd. So thank you for that.
Thanks, John. That's very kind.
Okay. You've already touched on this idea that John, the Apostle John, is preoccupied with the idea of Jesus being misunderstood, his language being misunderstood. And it is striking his willingness to be misunderstood. And it's seeming, courting misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to say something that I want you as a poet to respond to. And I read a lot more prose than poetry. I guess most people do. Probably poets do too, I guess. But I find poetry exhausting. And when I've done the work to make sense of it, I'm really glad I did. But it's very common for me just to kind of think. I mean, even in your book, I was like, when I got to the prose meditations, I was like, okay, this is so much easier. Because it's easy. I don't know if it's as true to say it's easy to misunderstand your poems, but I will say it's hard to understand the poems. Whether or not they're easy to misunderstand, they're definitely harder to. Your meditations at the end of the book are much more accessible.
Yeah.
And that's not a secret. I mean, you know that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the reasons why the prose meditations felt like a good complement to the poems, because the poems are that kind of workout verbally and mentally, and then hopefully some sort of sidelight on it. Yeah, I think poetry. So I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at that. if poetry attempts to be complex, it just becomes useless and academic. You know, you think even in prose of James Joyce, you know, James Joyce at his very best allowed himself to use language that was remarkable, extraordinary, stretching the limits of what a human being could write and what a human being can read. But it affected something, you know, when you read it, there's a correspondence between those words and reality that with the hard work enriches the reality. But I think some of his other work he wrote just to be deliberately obscure and arcane and elusive and annoying. I think poetry that's complex for the sake of being complex, it does a disservice to the reader. It breaks the vital contract between reader and writer, doesn't it? That I'm going to converse with you via this medium about the things that matter. But poetry that's dealing with complex issues, I think it's designed to slow us right down, really make us deliberate and think. I think particularly the 33 poems, because of the density of just a 33-word capture of something that's larger than the universe, you know, it really makes you slow down. Some poems, I think, you know, these are different poems than other poetry I'd write, really different. Other poetry, I think, sometimes slows you down after you've read it. It's a bit like the fighter jet landing on the deck of the aircraft carrier. You know, it moves at speed and then gets caught on a hook and is pulled back. And I think some poems do that for you. I mean, Emily Dickinson would do that for me, that you read it so super simple and then suddenly you're being ripped back again. You go, oh goodness, there's so much more in there. Whereas I think these poems, which are deliberative and meditative and contemplative, they do make us slow down at the start. They take time to read. And yeah, I think given the skim and scroll culture we're in now, a poem that makes us slow down is going to feel very countercultural. It's going to feel like landing in a different country. Yeah, I don't know that in any way talks about what you mentioned, Jonathan. I've managed to exhaust my own brain even talking about poetry. So,
well, I like that idea of poetry making us feel like we're in a different country. You know, the one job of the writer is to clarify and to make ideas accessible. But another job of a writer is to make things seem a little foreign.
Yeah.
Talk about Emily Dickinson. You know, so many of her poems where she's writing about something that is common enough, but by making it seem foreign, she makes you look at something you haven't been paying attention to. And I love that function of poetry. I say I love it. I love it eventually.
A qualified love, Jonathan. Yeah.
It is not a. It's. Good grief! What's the kind of love that unconditional love? That's
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because poetry is so in such a different realm than what I would do normally with words, which is preaching. And preaching is very often taking an extremely complicated set of ideas that are deeply contextualized in a world totally other than our own, whether that's New Testament or particularly Old Testament, and honoring the curation of that previous moment, that previous culture, not stripping it of that, but keeping it in it, and then bringing that into the world of the hearer so that it's comprehensible and also applicable. So preaching is almost like the reverse of what sometimes a poem can do. It's bringing the dense and making it plain, whereas sometimes poetry, I wouldn't say poetry seeks to make things be dense, but it takes the plain and makes it complex or observable, or as you say, that idea of distancing and disorientating the reader, and then finally reorientating them into another understanding. Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah, well, it's sort of the difference between, or it can be the difference between distilling and unfolding.
Yeah, that's
You
brilliant.
know? And so, especially when you're writing 33 word poems, there's a lot of distillation there.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I'm so interested in the way that you managed to include so many ideas in so few words. You've already mentioned the bread. You know, you wrote a poem about the bread of life, and it's the one that starts this loaf king whom we would crown just for crusts. You know, talking about the speaking of people misunderstanding what Jesus was up to. You know, as he fed the 5,000, or you know, or the 4,000. Anytime he fed people, you know, there was this sense that okay, this is a man who's bringing economic relief to the hungry, or and Jesus refusing to be crowned merely the you know, the economic savior. And eventually, you know, we're talking about manna by the time this 33 word poem is over, and it, you know, it takes me 33 sentences. That sentence took more than 33 words, you know, and you had a few more ideas in there besides those, and so that distillation, that concentration, that compactness is a very, as you said, a very different thing from you preaching for, say, you know, 25 minutes, 35 minutes on a couple of verses. Well, you're Baptist, so you probably preach 55 minutes.
In my dreams. Yeah, I mean, I think there is that, and I think that again, it comes back to, you know, so we've talked a little bit about misunderstanding, and that happens loads. But I think Jesus always insists on coming back to the root of what these words mean. So, you know, the likes of the Loaf King poem about, you know, that they would just make him king to get bread and get supplies, that economic savior. Jesus wants to reinvest manna with what it really meant, and that material provision with what it really meant. And so it's interesting. I don't think Jesus was ever, obviously he wasn't, but we could never, I think, misunderstand him as being deliberately obscure or shifting meaning in a kind of a postmodern way that he would destabilize meaning. Jesus was insisting on restabilizing that meaning back in its original context, and any instability that brought was the instability of correction rather than disorientation. You know, that he's insisting that this has a true meaning, which in our culture is so interesting, because we have, when I was an undergrad and a postgrad, you know, meaning was up for grabs. Meaning was decentralized. It was pulled out of any meta narrative, and we've applied that across the civic, the judicial, the political, the medical realm, and now people are coming back and longing that things would be re-centralized, but only through that destabilizing experience. You know what I mean? So I think Jesus is permanently insisting that the needle returns to true north. Again, that in many ways glorifies him, because it points him up as the word again, the originating word, the sort of the magnetic center of what meaning actually is. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate your saying that, because when a few minutes ago I said, you know, Jesus didn't mind being misunderstood, and I love that clarification. He was willing to be misunderstood because we have our own preconceived notions of how we're going to understand things, and when somebody tells it straight, it seems upside down.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which, again, you know, as long as since we've been talking about Emily Dickinson, you know, tell the truth, but tell it slant.
Yeah.
A lot of that is what Jesus was up to, what poets like you are up to. Thankfully, there are people, you know, like me who write prose who can come along and you know, straighten it out for everybody.
You can sweep the streets after the party, Jonathan. Get it all back.
That's right. After you, people like you are so wild and throwing things around. That's so good. All right. Well, let me let me ask you a question that I'm looking forward to hearing your answer to my customary question. Who are the writers that make you want to write?
I think there'd be a few. One from poetry, from secular poetry, would be Seamus Heaney. That's sort of the
I was going to be sad if he didn't come up.
Yeah, I mean, I think Heaney, again, you talk about distillation, Heaney, for me, was the first, an encounter with Heaney's language was the first time in my life that I realized just what words could do. I didn't understand all of it, but it was amazing to me. We had an English teacher called Mr. Martin. I went to an all-boys high school that was pretty uncultured, very uncouth. And Mr. Martin was a great guy because he had the common touch, but he also was deeply in love with literature. And I remember the first occasion that he read Seamus Heaney, his poem Digging, in class. I can actually remember the sensory experience of being in a warm room after lunchtime as a schoolboy, in my kind of brittle, that weird material they make school jumpers out of when I was growing up, in this sort of pinned experience, and those words penetrating all that kind of lethargy and realizing there's a whole world here. So Heaney, for me, has done that over and over again. He did it then. He did it through my student days. He's done it. He has formed how I see the world I live in, and I think that's so inspiring about writing. The only problem is that setting somebody like Seamus Heaney as an inspiration to write is just a humiliating experience. Yeah. So,
hey, I've got a quick question about Heaney and you. Is it, to what extent is the fact that he is from Northern Ireland? How important is that to you? That his native tongue is the same as yours? Yeah. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think there is that sense of probably that stage in my teens when I heard him first. The place names, the turn of the language was so different. I grew up I was born in the 1970s, grew up in the 1980s, and I don't mean this as any despite, but, media culture was highly Americanized then. Yeah. And then living in Northern Ireland, even local media tended to be highly anglicized. And so you never heard anyone really talk in your own tongue or your own turn of phrase. And place names, and areas that you're familiar with. I remember hearing someone on the radio one day saying, Americans have all the best place names because they get more syllables, like Alabama. And,
yeah, right.
But somebody like Heaney writing about Lough Neagh, which is literally 15 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. Yeah. For him to write about the Ards Peninsula, this great phrase, he says, the sky is big as over a runway. And then you drive, as a child then, or a young person in the car driving and going, that's exactly how that's captured. I suppose the way I put it is it localized poetry, but it poeticized the locality.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
And I think that for me was just a meeting point of things I'd never heard before. And it became a kind of a gateway then into, my dad worked in a coal yard and an oil company, didn't read poetry at all. But when I'd got into Heaney, I remember from his 16th birthday, he took me to a bookshop in Belfast and bought me the Contemporary Book of Irish Poetry. Penguin edition. I still have it now. It looks like somebody's kicked it up and down the yard a few times, but that book for me was just a new world. And the vast majority of it was modern poetry that I didn't understand, but there was a sensory experience in there of the words and so Heaney represented all of that. That's a hugely long answer, John. Sorry.
I was asking for it. I had similar feelings about Flannery O'Connor, who's from the same part of the world as where I grew up, and that what you said about poeticizing locality, the idea of the peacock sort of sweeping along the sort of red clay, hard scrabble landscape. Kind of, I hear you about that sort of, the bird of Hera also being the, walking in Middle Georgia meant a lot to me,
Wow, that's beautiful.
But anyway, you keep going. We've got Seamus Heaney.
Yeah, I suppose another writer that I've found really inspiring, and it's maybe an unusual choice, is Warren Wiersbe. Okay. I don't know how well known Warren Wiersbe is anymore at all, but he was the kind of staple of short Bible commentaries when I was growing up. The first serious Christian book I read was a friend gave me one of his little B commentary books on 1 Corinthians. And what Wiersbe did was he used language in a deeply servant-hearted way, and he lowered the ramp of both language and biblical exegesis to a level where someone like me at 15 or 16 could get on board. Yeah. And I think that has always inspired me, that writers who have functional strength as opposed to kind of bodybuilder writers who can show you their muscles. I've always loved that, and maybe that's part of my upbringing, which was not in a literary environment as a child. But Wiersbe to me just exemplifies the kind of the crucifixion of your own glory in order to glorify the crucified one through your words. And I know poetry doesn't necessarily serve that purpose. Maybe I'm thinking even about other stuff that I would write that's more prosaic, but I found Wiersbe, and latterly, in the last year, I've read Wiersbe wrote a book called Preaching and Teaching with Imagination, and I've suddenly realized that he had at his fingertips the world of literature. He was a much more lettered man than anyone would give him credit for, and he could, with ease and a very natural tone, draw all that into his conversation about imagination. And I thought, wow, he employed that without displaying that. And I love that. I find that very inspiring. Yeah. That all of this stuff, that there is no division between language when you write a poem to try and slow down and provoke thought, and when you write a sermon to try and elucidate and motivate and inspire. So yeah, Wiersbe would be, and again, it's such a, I think that's a bit of a left field choice, I know you should really be saying Ernest Hemingway, and but Warren Wiersbe, I just think is a great exemplar of a crucified writer. I just think that's
that's great. You're the first person to mention Warren Wiersbe on the Habit podcast. So, we had some Warren Wiersbe floating around the house when I was growing up too.
Yeah, it's just really unusual that, in our local Bible college, it used to be, that guys just readily plagiarized his material, and then I think that put him out of currency for a bit, but he's a bit of a hero.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, Andrew Roycroft, thank you so much for taking this time to talk about this poem. We haven't even mentioned the illustrations.
Oh, please, yeah.
But Ned Bustard did such a great job of those woodcuts or lino cuts or whatever I guess they're lino cuts probably.
Yeah.
With that sort of Book of Kells style that he does in so many anyway, I love the book. I love your part of it. I love Ned's part of it. Love Malcolm Geit's introduction or preface. So thanks for doing this work.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for having me today as well. It's been lovely to chat.
Yeah,
thanks for doing that. Yeah.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.